Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. It's your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me today. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends. Share it. That's how the audience grows. That's how the podcast grows. And I want to thank my audience because I always have the greatest audience. They're very engaged. And I love getting your emails. You could always email us here at podcast@pasreport.com. Now, before we dive into today's topic, President Trump announced, and again, he shocks everyone when he makes these announcements. He shocks the political class. And he announced that Dan Bongino is going to be the deputy director of the FBI. Kash Patel tapped him. And you talk about a commitment to reform government and hold Washington's elites accountable. Bongino's it, right? Bongino, you got a former NYPD officer, Secret Service agent, and he's been one of the most outspoken critics of the weaponization of the FBI, of our government. So to see him tapped as the deputy director, his appointment demonstrates just how serious President Trump is in changing the culture, changing the mindset of the bureaucracy. He wants to disrupt the status quo. The FBI has long strayed from its original purpose as an unbiased law enforcement body. It now serves as a political tool that government yields against political opponents, that government yields against those who deviate from the elite power structures that have such narrow-minded points of view. They don't like any criticism. They don't tolerate it. They label it as anti-American, anti-government sentiment. Most dangerous of all, though, is how the FBI has been used to target ordinary Americans. And I'm talking about parents at school board meetings, parents who express nothing more than criticism of what their children are learning. That, to me, is the shame of it. When you see the government storm people's homes because they protested abortion clinics, you see what's going on. And the overshadowing of the Bureau's primary role to protect American citizens and uphold the Constitution has been thoroughly disregarded. So the FBI allowed political biases to cloud its mission, and they have done an enormous amount of damage to their reputation, to the trust. With Kash Patel now as the FBI director, you have Dan Bongino, who's going to be serving as the deputy director. There is little doubt that change is coming, that there's going to be a house cleaning. And they're going to face pushback from the entrenched bureaucrats within the system. There is no doubt about that. But if there's one thing that we know about Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, it's that they don't back down. They're not going to back down from any type of fight. They'll push back against the bureaucracy, and the days of unchecked politicization at the FBI are hopefully coming to an end. And you're going to want to stay with the P.A.S. Report podcast because we'll talk about it more as the situation develops. But we can't have an FBI that targets political people. We can't have an FBI that pushes conservative ideology, progressive ideology. It's about law enforcement. Now, to the topic of today, I want to talk about Ukraine and President Trump's announcement that he intends to force a settlement between Ukraine and Russia. We have to face facts here, and that's what we do at the PAS Report. The Ukraine war, the Russia's war in Ukraine has been devastating. And you want to talk about death and destruction, over 1 million soldiers dead, young people, their whole lives ahead of them. We're talking about tens of thousands of innocent civilians being killed or injured, critical infrastructure in ruins. And it's going to be at least a decade, possibly more, before they could rebuild what's been destroyed. This war has gone on for far too long, and we felt the effects here at home. It's not like this hasn't really impacted us. You have hundreds of billions of tax dollars being transferred overseas as we have no real strategy, as we have major problems ourselves here at home, problems like veterans care, like homelessness, an old and dilapidated infrastructure, a failed education system, a military that has been depleted. It's 1/3 below its readiness levels. We have so many issues here in the United States of America. We've seen energy prices increase because of this war. The cost of products like fertilizer more than doubled. And understand that when energy and fertilizer doubles, well, so does food costs. It's devastated household budgets throughout the United States. It's impacted each and every one of us, and we have to acknowledge this. Everyday folks like you listening to the podcast, you all paid the price in more ways than one. Not just with our tax dollars to fund this war, which has been a disaster, but we've increased our debt. We had to take on the higher energy and grocery bills, and it hasn't been pleasant. In my view, the tragedy is that so much of this was predictable. It was predictable and it was preventable. I warned in March of 2021, a year before Russia's invasion, that Putin may be intending to invade Ukraine. This isn't rocket science. Once the war started, it was easy to predict how it would ultimately go, especially the longer that the war lasted. People don't base decisions anymore and their opinions on reality. They base it on what they hope things to be. And that's true of Biden administration and our failed policymakers who have been in charge of our foreign policy for the last few decades, and it's been a disaster. In the war, they had a window of opportunity to prevent it, but they ignored it. Once the war began, they had an opportunity to end it. We saw the Istanbul Agreement. But because of their hubris, they torpedoed it. And Ukraine has paid a very heavy price because of that. The so-called foreign policy experts, the people that we've been listening to for decades, which I don't know why at this point, because they failed by every metric. They could have prevented, they could have ended the conflict. And the reason I bring it up is because they should be called out, they should be shamed, and they should be banished from ever having influence over our foreign policy again. Not for nothing, but they claim they care about Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. They claim they care about Ukrainian independence and freedom. But let's be real, that was never the case. They don't care. Understand, to Biden's inner circle, to war hawks like Lindsey Graham, Liz Cheney, and Adam Kinzinger, when you look at the Bill Kristols of the world and the Max Boots, Ukraine was just a pawn on the chessboard. And now you have President Trump, who is going to push a settlement agreement, and the same people, the very same people that created this mess in the first place, are the same ones screaming the loudest. But what's the alternative? And notice, these fools, they never provide any specifics. They never provide what their vision of an endgame looks like. They never propose solutions to end the war. They only provide the means to keep it going, and that's what they want to see. They want to see this war continue. Meanwhile, you have Russia that continues to advance ever so slowly, taking territory inch by inch, foot by foot. Soldiers being thrown into the meat grinder to achieve Russia's objectives and take over parts of the country. That's what's going on. And what do you think the median age of the average Ukrainian soldier is? Some may think it's 18, 19, 20-year-olds. They're the ones that usually do the fighting. It's usually young people. But Ukraine is out of young people. And the median age is now 43 years old. Think about that for a moment. And I'll talk more about that later. I'll talk more about what it really means. So you have President Trump who's taking a stand saying this war's got to end in our national interest. And there's no doubt about it that it's bold, not because it's Trump. It's bold because it goes against the Uni Party. The Uni Party wants to drag this on. The establishment within the United States wants to keep it on. But Trump wants to pressure both sides to come to an agreement. And it's not going to be easy. But doing nothing is going to be a catastrophe. So in this episode, I'm going to break down how we got here, what a forced settlement looks like, and most importantly, what's in America's strategic interest, because it's about us. Understand, we elect presidents to do what's in our best interest. It's important to take a closer look at the predictable nature of the war in Ukraine. How this all evolved is important because we have to hold policymakers accountable. They're the ones that helped pave the way for the crisis. They are responsible for this crisis. And for starters, the warning signs about Russia's intent were obvious. When Putin began moving tens of thousands of troops, when he began moving heavy military equipment to Ukraine's border, it's not like these were just standard military drills. You have to build out barracks to take care of 95,000 troops, mess halls. It's extraordinarily expensive operations, building military hospitals, feeding thousands of troops, providing them with hygiene in remote locations. And I warned on this podcast back in March of 2021, nearly a year before the invasion began, that Russia was setting the stage for something big. Again, political science isn't rocket science. International politics is actually predictable, very easily predictable. You just use the levels of analysis. But the real turning point came after our catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan in September of 2021. Think about it logically. The sole superpower spent 2 decades in Afghanistan only to watch the Taliban reclaim the country in a matter of days. And they're even better armed and equipped today than they were prior to 9/11. This is a colossal failure, and it put the Biden administration's incompetence on full display to the rest of the world. I mean, if you're Putin, you realize the American public following Afghanistan had no appetite for another major conflict. You realize that the American military machine, that there were defects in it, that we don't have the political will. And I'm not saying that we should have stayed in Afghanistan forever, far from it. But the withdrawal could have been handled in a much more competent way. We could have prevented the Taliban from taking over the country, and the Biden administration failed to do that. And that sent a message to the rest of the world. That sent the message that America is no longer the superpower it once was. That America is willing to spend 20 years at war, nearly $2 trillion, over 2,400 soldiers coming back in flag-draped coffins, tens of thousands of wounded, and we missed our political objectives. We did not achieve them. And I truly believe that once Putin saw the way the withdrawal was going, I truly believe that that's when he made a decision to greenlight the invasion of Ukraine. That's when he said that we don't have to worry about an American response. He'll slap some sanctions on us, and then that's that. Okay, then in January of 2022, Biden holds a press conference, and he hints that a minor incursion by Russia is not going to trigger a firm response. They don't have to worry about that. And not surprisingly, Putin took that as a green light. Listen to what Biden had to say when it came to the idea of a minor incursion.
So I think what you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades. And it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera.
I mean, that was a disaster. That was a disaster that he said that out loud. And then you have Russia conducting joint military exercises with Belarus near Ukraine's northern border. Now, military exercises are nothing new. We do them all the time. But when the exercises ended, Russian forces left their equipment right where it was. An obvious red flag that an invasion was imminent. Yet the Biden administration sat on its hands. It sat on its hands for nearly a year, knowing about the real possibility of an invasion. So finally, February 2022, the invasion happens. And it creates massive instability in an already volatile world. Despite this, Ukraine initially holds its ground. Okay, and this presented a prime opportunity to end the war quickly because behind the scenes you had then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett along with France and Turkey working to broker some type of agreement, some type of ceasefire between Putin and Zelensky. The Istanbul Agreement, it could have ended the conflict just a few months after the war began. Ukraine would simply commit to neutrality and acknowledge Russia's claim to the Crimea. In return, Russia would withdraw its forces from the Ukrainian territory, particularly the eastern provinces and the Donbass region, and Ukraine would be allowed to seek security guarantees from Western countries, including the United States. While they may not be able to join NATO, at least they could get security and defense guarantees. Now, this deal could have saved countless lives. It could have prevented further devastation, added some stability back into the international system. But the Biden administration and the war hawks, the elites, the Washington foreign policy geniuses, in all their glory and wisdom, they had other plans. Instead of pushing for the Istanbul Agreement, they threatened Ukraine. They threatened Ukraine not to make any deal with Russia or else they would be cut off. They sent UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to warn Zelensky that if he signed any peace agreement with Putin, it's game over. All Western support's going to come to an end, whether it's economic, military, and if Putin tried to invade again, Ukraine's going to be on its own. The United States is not going to defend Ukraine in its future. And so they boxed Zelensky into a corner. I mean, remember, who's financing this whole thing? See, the mindset among these policymakers was that Ukraine's early successes on the battlefield would continue And this had the potential to topple Putin's regime. It had the potential to weaken Russia dramatically in the international system. But here's the thing. Anyone with two functioning brain cells could see that a prolonged conflict would eventually favor Russia. I mean, again, it's just about being honest. Russia is the larger power. It has more resources to draw upon. It was always the stronger, more dominant country, but the policymakers didn't care. By rejecting the Istanbul Agreement, the neocons and the Biden administration allowed the conflict to rage on. They allowed the conflict to escalate. It prolonged the war that could have been contained and concluded in 2.5 months? February 2022. By May of 2022, it could have ended. And you have people now angry that President Trump would even suggest a settlement between the two countries. What people should be angry about is the fact that the war is still being waged when it could have been ended long ago. That's what people should be angry about, that the war was entirely preventable. You have all this stupidity in the name of a misguided belief that Russia could be brought to its knees by Ukraine, that Russia could be conclusively beaten in a drawn-out fight. These are your foreign policy experts. As the elites, they wanted to keep this war going. Who paid the price for it? Who paid the price? Well, Ukrainians paid in blood and territory. We paid in economics. The war they wanted, the elites wanted, was doomed from the start. But they were blinded by hubris that did immense harm to the United States, hubris that has infected our foreign policy over the course of 25 to 30 years. Now, we need to take a quick break, but in the next segment, I'm going to talk about realistic expectations, what a forced settlement would look like, and why this is important, why we need to end the war in Ukraine. So hang tight, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the P.A.S. Report podcast. Now, one of the big problems that we have in the United States, and apparently it's afflicting most of the Western world, it's a disease. And it's a disease that we now base policy on what we hope happens rather than base policy on the situation as it is. Ben Shapiro always likes to say facts don't care about your feelings. Well, when we look at the international landscape, the international environment doesn't care about your emotions. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about what's right or wrong, what's moral or ethical. Our foreign policy used to be based on realist philosophies with hints of idealism infused into it. However, that's changed. It seems now that it's based entirely on idealism and what we hope happens as opposed to what is going to happen. We don't deal with the situations at hand. We deal with what we hope it to be. Was it right for Russia to invade Ukraine? No. They were the aggressor. It's not hard to say that. I know the administration isn't saying that. I think they're not saying that because they want to start the negotiations. And if they start bashing Russia, well, why would Russia come to the table? You have to understand that the foreign policy experts that are ripping the idea that we're not outright bashing Russia are the ones that don't want an agreement. But Russia was the aggressor. It's easy for me to say that. And is it fair that in any type of forced settlement, Ukraine is going to have to give up some of its territory? Obviously, that's not fair. Obviously, it's not right. But guess what? Life isn't fair. When it comes to geopolitics, reality seldom aligns with morality or ethics. Just look at history. Any student of history will know that. And I'll talk about what a settlement looks like in a few minutes. But before I get to that, let's address those who are outraged by any suggestion that Ukraine could be forced into a deal. My question for you, if you truly believe that, my question for you, what's the alternative? What is the alternative? Explain it to us. How do you envision this war ending? How do you actually plan to get there? See, saying that a thorough defeat and surrender of Russia and the elimination of Vladimir Putin, that's not realistic. But we can't have an actual debate in this country because everyone puts emotion before logic, before reason, before truth. And we have to confront the hard truth, the truth that there's only one way Ukraine can fully defeat Russia. And let's just say it out loud. If America directly enters the war, we're talking about U.S. military boots on the ground, a kinetic war against Russia, a full-scale mobilization that has to include a military draft. Now, I don't know why we have these stupid superficial debates based on nothing but emotions. Let's talk about what needs to happen. Let's be honest with the American people, and let's have the debate and let the American people decide where we should go with this. I don't know why we can't be honest about that. We could continue to throw money at this. We can arm the Ukrainians to the teeth. But what we've been doing for 3 years obviously isn't working. All the evidence shows that. And I don't care if you give them more sophisticated weaponry. The truth is, the war will continue to grind on. And Russia will continue to advance very slowly deeper into Ukrainian territory. That's what will happen. It's easy to call for perpetual fighting when you have no stake in the game, when you're over 5,000 miles away from the battlefield. But consider the state of our current military. You have recruitment numbers that have plummeted over the last 4 years. And our readiness levels are below what the threshold should be. You have only 18 or 19% of war officers believing that we could fight a war to death. Think back to how thin we were stretched when we were fighting in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You had soldiers doing 5, 6, 7, 8 different tours. Understand, in World War II, going against Italy, Germany, and Japan, most soldiers went 1, 2 tours, 5, 6, 7 tours. Do you know what that does to a soldier? Do you know how that impacts them? And we're not ready. We're not equipped for a lengthy, high-intensity conflict, especially against an adversary like Russia. Ultimately, we could defeat Russia. I'm not saying we can't defeat them, but it's going to cost a lot of blood and treasure. And when you begin to add realism, well, now it becomes a much more difficult debate, right? Because now we have to commit ourselves. We have to commit our sons and daughters to the fight, knowing that they're going to be coming home injured, wounded, loss of limbs, maybe even in body bags. And if we don't have enough troops and we have to institute a draft, understand they're not starting with people like me that are 45 years old. They're going to start with the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. That's what they will start with. This is the sacrifice that you have to make if you truly believe, if you truly want them to win this war. That's the sacrifice. So when you take the emotion out of the issue, you begin to see things a little more clearly. You begin to think twice about the policy and the impacts it has, and about prolonging the war. This isn't about Democrats or Republicans. It's about America. It's about the American people. It's about what is in America's best interest. And if we are being honest with ourselves, if we are unwilling to engage with Russia militarily, Ukraine cannot win this war. It really is that simple. We can choose a different path. We could let the war rage on. We could continue to give them the money. We could continue to give them the weaponry. But let's get our emotion out of it. Let's take our emotion away and see, how does that change the conflict? And it doesn't, because as we've seen, the war will continue to grind on. More death, more destruction, and Russia will continue to make small but incremental gains on the battlefield, as they've been doing over the course of the last 3 years. I said in the beginning that the average age of a Ukrainian soldier fighting Russia is about 43 years old. You need to understand, wars are typically fought by those who are 18 to 25. Those are the people on the front lines. Those are the people on the battlefield. I mean, if you look at our military, the median age of our combat soldiers is about 24 years old. That's the median age of combat soldiers. In Ukraine, it's 43. So why is it so high? It's because they're running out of young people. That's why. For decades, Ukraine has faced an outflow of young people that are leaving the country. And you factor in the Ukrainians, the war, and seeing the devastation and how many young Ukrainians have been killed by Russian forces, and you begin to see it. And this change happened radically. Understand, when Russia first invaded, the median age of a Ukrainian soldier was 30 to 33. But so many soldiers have been injured or killed that they've had to continually raise the age of their draft. They've also had to lower the standards of those who are being drafted. Now, even drug addicts and criminals can be drafted. So the median age will continue to increase as new recruits are receiving less training because they have to be rushed to the front lines. Their death and destruction continues. We are going to see at what point Does the age go up to 45, 46, 47, 50 years old? You know, throughout history, war always gets romanticized, but the brutal truth is that war is nothing but death and destruction to achieve political objectives. That's the truth. And if this continues unchecked, without any forced settlements, there's only one way it ends. Ukraine is going to face an unconditional surrender. That's it. Russia's going to take far more territory, and potentially the entire country of Ukraine falls to Russia. So again, if you're someone that believes that Ukraine has to win at any and all costs, but we're not going to get involved militarily, I ask you, which is worse? Some form of forced settlement or the complete destruction of Ukraine? What is worse? It's a very simple question. And if you sit there and say, well, if we just arm them more, Ukraine's going to turn the tide, you're not basing your analysis on reality. You're basing your analysis on your emotions. So it's time to strip away the emotions, look at the cold, hard reality, and realize that there are no ideal outcomes here. The longer this continues, the worse it's going to be for Ukraine. We have to understand, you want this war to end, and now we have to take a look at what a forced settlement would look like. What would be in America's interest? Part of the problem is that Ukraine is in a position of weakness, whereas they were in a position of strength when the war actually first began, when the Istanbul Agreement was developed. Now they have to negotiate from a position of weakness. That's on the Biden administration, that's on the neocons, that's on the war hawks and DC elites. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't have any leverage. They do. First of all, let's not forget, the United States has enormous leverage over both countries. I mean, with the amount of money that we have given to Ukraine, with the amount of support that we've given Ukraine, the amount that they're going to need to rebuild and our help with the rebuilding and the protection going forward, Ukraine has to answer to us. Again, you may not like that, but we will get to dictate Ukrainian policy. Again, this is the real world. Why do you think we give the Egyptian military $1 billion a year? Well, we give them $1 billion a year to do our bidding. That's how international politics works. We are the ones that get to direct Ukraine. And then we do have leverage over Russia with sanctions. But first, I want to start with the Ukrainians, because most people are unaware. Ukraine is still in control of parts of the Russian city of Kursk. There are different estimates. Some say it's only 30%, some say it's 40%. But at least Ukraine has some territory that could be part of negotiations. Russia controls many of the border provinces, particularly the Donbass and Donetsk region. And they continue to make gains in the south as well, moving north. So we have to look at this territory. Any settlement between Russia and Ukraine is going to require Ukraine to withdraw from Kursk. And Russia is going to have to pull back its forces in the south and some of its forces in the east. However, I don't anticipate Russia is going to fully withdraw from the deep eastern parts of Ukraine. This is a complicated region. Half the population wants to be part of the Russian Federation. The other half wants to remain part of Ukraine. And you have the eastern separatists that exist. Again, very complicated area. But this is precisely where America's leadership can come into play. This is where our leverage comes into play over Russia. We have tons of sanctions on Russia, and it's critical that we use that leverage. We could compel Russia to return some of the occupied territories in the south and east back to Ukraine. And in return, America could slowly lift some of the sanctions after certain benchmarks are met. Now, I know this is setting some people's hair on fire, saying, oh, you're just rewarding Putin. You're a Putin plant. You're a Russian apologist. You're a Russian propagandist. No, it's about, again, the reality of the situation that the neocons got us in. Similar to the Istanbul Agreement, you are going to see a requirement of Ukrainian neutrality. Ukraine is going to have to recognize that Crimea is now part of Russian territory. And they're going to have to sign an agreement that they will not seek NATO membership. This isn't rocket science. I don't know why people are so hung up on this idea of NATO. NATO is an important military alliance. I'm not denying that. I mean, NATO is actually one of the more successful intergovernmental organizations that exists out there. But why should we let Ukraine join NATO? It doesn't make any sense. I understand if you're from the Ukraine, if you're from a smaller country, why you would want to join NATO. It makes perfect sense to me. No one joins NATO because they want the protection of the Belgian military, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, thank God, Belgium's going to come in and rescue us. They joined NATO because they want the American military defense umbrella. That's what they want. They want the United States military to back them up, and to a lesser degree, you have the United Kingdom, France, and Poland, all with strong militaries. So if they join NATO, it makes sense. It increases their power overnight. It increases stability overnight for them. However, for the United States, it doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't give us any benefits. It does nothing but increase our risk. They gain the instant protection of our military might, and we incur another security liability that could drag us into a conflict and has nothing to do with our strategic interests. Does that make sense to any one of you out there? So NATO membership is going to be a no-go for Ukraine. And again, I don't understand why it's that big of a deal. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, when America was in talks with Russia, there was the unspoken agreement that NATO wouldn't expand into places like Ukraine. Then you have 2005, things started to change. 2008, you have the NATO meeting. Now they're talking about Ukraine joining NATO. Just because Ukraine can't join NATO, it won't mean that they can't have security guarantees with other countries. So in return for the no NATO membership, Russia is going to be forced to accept the idea that Ukraine can still seek security guarantees from other countries, including the United States of America. Russia would also be forced to commit that they're not going to restart the conflict, that they're not going to occupy any additional Ukrainian territory. And if Russia were to violate the final agreement, well, then you could talk about Ukraine's NATO membership potentially. Then that could be reconsidered. What to me is even more compelling of what Trump is doing is the ongoing negotiation between the Trump administration and the Ukrainian government over Ukraine's mineral resources. See, the president is pushing for a deal that would grant us strategic access and mineral rights on Ukrainian soil. This is a bold move. And it's bold because people are like, oh, the United States is going to steal Ukrainian minerals. No, we're going to pay for these minerals, okay? We're going to be the ones that extract the minerals. We're going to be the ones that bring the minerals back to here, that strengthen our country. And the Ukrainian government, people in Ukraine are going to have jobs. They're going to have infrastructure. They're going to get an economic benefit from this. But most importantly, this is a move that would actually deter Russian aggression. It strengthens our economy, because it provides us with the vital natural resources that we need, rather than rely on China for all these resources. So we diminish our reliance on China, we strengthen our economy, we strengthen our power and influence, and Russia would really risk, if they invade Ukraine, when we have a presence there, and we have these valuable resources, that's going to be a problem. That boxes Russia into a corner. Are they really going to invade knowing that? This will also serve as a repayment for our support to the Ukraine. Makes sense to me. And it's going to be fascinating to see what happens next, how this all unfolds. But there is one universal truth that is crystal clear. We need to stop listening to the so-called foreign policy experts who have routinely gotten it wrong over the last several decades. Not only have they gotten it wrong, but they have weakened the United States. We have lost power and influence around the world because of their stupid decisions, because of their hardcore ideological beliefs, because of their idealism about the United States spreading democracy, overthrowing governments, conducting regime change. Listen, I'd rather deal with an authoritarian government that does what we want as opposed to a failed state that only brings more war, more death, more destruction, causes more instability. As a nation, we have to be realistic about the issues we face, both domestically and internationally. We have to get beyond our emotions. We have to stop viewing everything through the prism of how we feel. It doesn't matter how you feel. Nobody cares. Sometimes in life and throughout history, things aren't going to be fair, but it is what it is. And you have to approach a situation as it is, not as you wish it would be. We need to do what's in America's strategic interest, not Ukraine's, not Russia's, not China's, not Britain's, not France, but what's in our strategic interest. That's the point of a nation state. That's the point of having a president. Now, I hope you found the content of this episode informative, and if you did, take 30 seconds, write a great review for the P.A.S. report on any podcast platform that allows it, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating. Also, share this episode with others. You subscribe, you share it, the podcast continues to grow, and check out the P.A.S. report website, pasreport.com. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.